Hey everybody. This is going to be the first of a couple of videos that I'm going to make on industrialization in America. And in order to really understand industrialization, we have to understand the economic system that created industrialization, capitalism. In this, we're going to get into some economic stuff, which I know can be a little bit intimidating, but I'm going to do my best to define these terms and make it a little bit accessible so that we understand these terms when they come up later. Whenever we talk about an economic system, I'm always reminded of a joke about fish, strangely enough, where there's an old fish swimming along and two younger fish come by swimming in the opposite direction. And as they pass, the old fish says to the young fish, "Good morning, boys, how's the water?" And later on, the one young fish turns to the other and says, "How's the what?" Now, the point of this joke is that sometimes we can be so immersed in something that it becomes hard to even see it. And just like the water was invisible to the fish, capitalism can be invisible to us, even though everything in our lives, from where we go to work and where we live and how our schools work and even what we eat, is molded by this kind of quote unquote invisible hand of capitalism. This is especially difficult for us because capitalism is often thought of as sort of the natural state of humans, but in reality, as historians, we can identify that capitalism is only about 400 years old, depending on your definition. And speaking of definitions, let's talk about a couple. So, capitalism is an economic system defined by private citizens owning the means of production. And let's break that down a little bit further. When we say means of production, we're talking about anything that can be used to create valuable products or incomes. Historically, these have been things like agricultural land, workshops, mines, and then later on factories. But basically, this is anything that can be used to create a product or to create value. And when we mention private citizens in this definition, we're talking about regular people who are free to own property without special privileges. This is standing in contrast to maybe a feudal monarchy that we've studied before, where the only people who were really allowed to own land were the king and the nobility. And these private citizens would be encouraged to actively participate in the economy with the promise of profit. And profit, as you might know, is when you make more money out of a transaction than you put into it. Now, to illustrate the principles of capitalism, it'll help us to backtrack a little bit and explore what existed before capitalism. So now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into feudalism, which is the economic system that existed throughout most of Europe for literally thousands of years before capitalism came along. Hundreds of generations of people, where over 90% of the people under this system were engaged in hard, awful, backbreaking agricultural labor while simultaneously having no personal property rights and no real promise of improving their circumstances. This begins to change in about the 1600s as new goods are kind of flowing in from the colonization of the Americas and Southeast Asia, and the scientific revolution is bringing about new types of technology. We see a new class begin to emerge. This class begins as merchants and artisans who begin making a lot of money by engaging in this type of trade and exchange. Merchants and artisans tended to be focused in cities or boroughs, and it's from the French word for someone who lives in a borough that we get the name for this new class, the bourgeoisie. Maybe you've heard that term before, but I can almost guarantee that you've heard a more contemporary slang term that comes from bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were different because they weren't peasants doing agricultural labor, and they weren't lords who just owned the land and collected what was produced on it. The bourgeoisie come to make their money in an entirely new way. Now, maybe initially this class made their money through trading or through producing artisan goods, specialty goods, through skilled work. But what comes to define them is entrepreneurship. And you've probably heard the term entrepreneur. It's another one of these fancy French words. What it translates to is approximately adventurer. And what an entrepreneur does is kind of similar to going on an adventure in that you put in an initial investment, there is a risk, and there's a chance at profit. Now, what this meant at the time was, let's say that you are some wealthy merchant living in some city, and you hear about some new machine that can weave fabric way faster than a peasant in the countryside can. And so you put up some money, and this is a little bit risky because maybe this doesn't work out. Maybe the machine doesn't work as well as you hoped that it would. But if you're lucky and if you're good at what you do, then maybe, just maybe, you can turn that small investment of buying a machine into a very, very profitable cloth weaving business that can make you tons of money over a long period of time. You make the investment, you buy the machine, which includes some risk, but maybe you make some profit as a result of this. Now, at this point, you may be saying, hey, that sounds familiar to me. And that's because this concept of investment is basically the same as the modern concept of a stock market, which you may or may not be familiar with. Basically, what a stock is a tiny little piece of a company. If you go to the stock market and you buy a stock, you become a partial owner of that company. And if the company does well, you can maybe sell that stock for a profit as the value goes up, or if maybe the company goes bankrupt and you lose all your money, which is a bummer. Now, this is a moment where I'm going to have to ask you to remember the fish that can't see the water that they're swimming in. Because everything that I just described, you're probably thinking, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You invest in a business, and then if the business does well, you make some money. This would have sounded totally crazy to a medieval king or a feudal lord. Like what? You just expect me to let people accumulate money for themselves and invest in businesses, let people open businesses and let businesses go out of business willy-nilly? This would have sounded crazy to them. But what the philosophers and the economists that studied these things noticed is that societies that allowed this sort of free exchange of goods and services, that freely allowed anybody to open businesses to freely start and fail, tended to be more economically prosperous than the traditional feudal societies where you had feudal lords just focusing on making their own money and producing agricultural goods. This is where we're going to get our last sort of technical French term of this video, which is laissez-faire. This is French for literally for let do, or let people do what they want, let it happen. And this was an idea presented by economists that said that if you allowed people to engage in this free trade, that more economic growth would follow. We're going to focus in on some of these concepts by taking a look at a text by Adam Smith called The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Adam Smith is kind of seen as the most famous kind of philosopher and economist, kind of the father of capitalism. And one of the big concepts that he identifies is that of the invisible hand, which isn't quite as spooky as it sounds. I'm reading from a modified version of The Wealth of Nations here. As every individual endeavors as much as he can to employ his capital in the support of industry, and so to direct that industry to produce the greatest value, he generally does not intend to promote the public good. But by directing that industry to produce the greatest value, he is led by an invisible hand to promote the interests of society. So what that means essentially is that if you have a society where you have lots and lots of these entrepreneurs who are investing intending really only to benefit themselves, that the economic growth created by this profit is going to wind up benefiting the entire economy. It's going to wind up growing the whole economy. And in a lot of ways, this proved to be true. The economies that employed this laissez-faire capitalist system were more likely to have more efficient companies because the investors weren't interested in wasting their profit on inefficient modes of production. They were also more likely to invest in new technology and be kind of on the cutting edge of new innovations. One of the most famous examples of this is actually the American Revolution. Many of the outraged leaders of the revolution were themselves investors and merchants and even smugglers who were really mad at the King of England for restricting their trade. I mean, the causes of the revolution that we discussed were the violation of colonist property rights through unfair taxes and the restriction of free trade. Remember, previous to the revolution, Americans were trading with French and Spanish and Dutch empires, and then the king decided that they had to only trade with the British. When the Founding Fathers talked about liberty and independence, they were talking primarily about economic rights. So then, what happens? The Americans win the revolution, and unfettered capitalism brings prosperity to all and ushers in a brave new world? No. Sure, capitalist pursuit of profit led to economic advancement and economic growth and greater efficiency, but the relentless pursuit of personal profit didn't always lead to ethical outcomes or positive outcomes for everyone involved. For instance, if you're a business owner, wages that you pay to your workers are just another expense. And if you're trying to maximize your profit, you're going to try to keep those wages as low as possible. And when we're talking about the early capitalist period, many people sought to reduce those wages to zero through slavery. Many of these early capitalist investments in things like transatlantic trade and colonization were so profitable because they were reliant on slavery. I mean, it turns out you can make a lot of money if you don't pay the people working for you. I mean, remember, the Founding Fathers who embraced John Locke's ideas of life, liberty, and property believed that the right to property included the right to own people as property. And after slavery's abolition in the 1860s, capitalism will continue to grow and modernize the American economy, though often at the expense of great human suffering. Now to recap. In this video, we defined capitalism and we explored its emergence from feudalism. We practiced our French, learning the terms bourgeoisie, entrepreneur, and laissez-faire, and we covered the basic economic concepts of investment, risk, profit, and stock. Next time, we'll cover some more complex economic concepts and then jump into more modern industrial capitalism in the United States at the turn of the 20th century and talk about how that period shaped the world we live in today. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.